you've been following the last couple of weeks, I had done the homilies on the theological virtues of faith and hope, and today on that final theological virtue of charity. And charity in love, whichever one you want to use, like we kind of need to figure out what does that term really mean for us when it comes to a theological virtue that God infuses into our hearts. Because we use those words in many different ways. Charity has kind of become more of a, what money or things that you can give to others who are in need, which is a good thing, but it doesn't encompass what we're completely talking about. And then we use the word love in many different ways. For instance, I love pizza and I love cookies, chocolate chip cookies, by the way. But we use love, but I love those differently than I love my mother, for instance, rightly so. And so we use that word a lot for everything. So what is this theological virtue of love? What are we talking about when we say that? What is this thing that God infuses into us? And I'm going to use the Greeks. They understood this. They had 4 different terms for love. And it kind of encompasses those different varieties of it. And the one that we're talking about is their highest form that is used over and over in the Gospels by the evangelists. It's the word that they took up that Jesus means when he says love. And it is basically agape. It's this Greek word, and it means crucified love. It means this self-giving, this pouring out of oneself. It's hard. It's the hard love. It's the difficult love to live, but it's crucified love. And here's where we kind of see it with in the gospel. Peter, kind of one of my favorite guys in the gospel because he's always failing, right? And there's always hope for us because I fail all the time. And Peter, from the very beginning, every time that he fails and he gets something wrong or he doesn't grasp it yet, it's always has to do with the cross. Every time. Every time. He's the one who recognizes Jesus as the Messiah, the Son of God, the one who has been sent by the Father. And then 3 seconds later, he tells, when Jesus says, I must go and be handed over to the leaders and I will be crucified. And Peter says, hey, Jesus, come here. No, we're not going to, that's not going to happen. And he says, get behind me, Satan, right? And then later on, where does Peter deny Jesus at? When he's going to the cross, because he didn't want to be associated with it. He didn't want to also be crucified. And then finally, in the end of John's gospel, Jesus is risen now. He's died on the cross and rose from the dead. And he's standing there on the shore, and the apostles come in from the boat, and he has a conversation with Peter. And he says to Peter, do you love me? And in the Greek, he says, do you agape me? Will you die like I did for me? Is that how much you love me? And Peter's like, I love you like a friend, Lord. And then he says again, do you love me like I love you? I love you like a friend, Lord. And then Jesus says, do you love me like a friend, Peter? And Peter was grieved and sad in that moment. But Peter said, you know that I love you, Lord. And then Jesus gives this really strange saying, which is basically what it looks like when someone is led out to be crucified. And he tells Peter, this will happen to you. And it's that point you will be able to love me like I love you. It's this crucified love that God calls us to. That's the virtue that he plants into our heart at baptism. One that needs to be to grow and cooperated with God's grace so that we can love like that as well, because that's what God calls us to. That's the very small thing God calls us to do, to love like him. As a matter of fact, he says that in whenever you're reading the Gospels and somebody asks Jesus, what's the greatest commandment? He says, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind and all your strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. And then later on, Jesus says to his apostles, to love like I love you. which is right before he's getting ready to go to the cross. So this is the love that we're talking about. Where does it come from? This has been something I've been praying about a lot recently, that in the Trinity, right, which is what Jesus came to reveal, who God is in himself, you have the Father who pours himself out completely to the Son. The Son receives the love of the Father, nothing held back. And it's so profound, right? It begets the second person of the Trinity who receives that love and gives it back to the Father. And that exchange of love between the two is so profound that we call him the Holy Spirit, the love between the Father and the Son. And so that's what the Son does, receives the love of the Father and gives it back. Now, when he comes into the world, which is what we're preparing to celebrate at Christmas, as a little child, that's precisely, he does the same thing he's been doing from all eternity. He is going to pour himself out in love of the Father and us. That's who Jesus is. He didn't hold anything back. He came to show us who God is, that God is the one who will come down to the ungrateful creatures that have sinned and save them from themselves. As a matter of fact, we see it right at the cross as Jesus is pouring out his whole life right there on the cross for us. He says, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. This is the love that God places in our hearts at our baptism. This is the love that he calls us to live in this life over and over again in each situation that we face daily. We're meant to live from this love, to pour ourselves out as God has poured himself out for us. That's no small feat, is it? It's not natural. It's not what we're normally inclined to, because we saw that in Jesus' preaching in the Sermon on the Mount. He gets to this part, he goes, you've heard it said, love your friends and hate your enemies, right? And he says, but I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. And everybody's like, what? Love my enemies? Like, we're talking about the Romans that are occupying us right now. I got to love my enemies? Are you kidding me? But it's not natural. It's supernatural. That's why you need God's help. We can't do it without him. As a matter of fact, there's about 6,000 years worth of biblical history that shows that it can't be done without him, right? We need what he brings to us, which is his life poured into us, his love poured into us. As John tells us in his letter, God is love. So the more we allow that love that God has placed in our heart to be lived, to be nourished through the sacraments and prayer and actually doing it. So there's many different ways this plays out. First of all, love of God. The only way to love God in return is for him to help us with his love, to give it back to him. Love him with everything you got. He has to be the center of our life. Then we meant to love those around us, those closest to us, right? In a very self-sacrificing way, a crucified love. That's what it looks like to love. It hurts, right? And sometimes it hurts to even love those around us because we're struggling with them. But we're meant to pour ourselves out for them. But I think the top of the chain of what's my love looking like in my life, how am I living out this virtue that God has given me, is always going to be found in how do I love those who are my enemies, because that's the hardest. And by the way, I think why Jesus tells us to love our enemies is because when you start to love your enemy, they are no longer your enemy. It changes in your own heart. But I want you to think about this today, because this is where we really have to go. There's always somebody that we have to forgive. There's always someone who has hurt us, and sometimes very badly. And God says, if you want to love like me, you have to forgive them, right? And it's going to hurt. It's crucified love. That's precisely what he did on the cross. There we are crucifying the God of the universe. And he says, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. He spent some of his last breath to say that so that we could do it ourselves. So who is that person that's come up in your heart and mind as I'm talking? Because I know they're there. They come up in mind. He's like, that person is the one I need to love, but I can't do it on my own. God doesn't expect us to do it on our own. He expects us to invite him into our heart to do it. So you have to say a little prayer. Lord, help me to forgive this person, this thing. Help me to love them as you do. Because there's not a person in this life that you will meet that God doesn't love. And he's going to have to help us to love those who are hardest to love, who maybe have hurt us. But that is going to be how you begin to love like the Lord does, like he calls us to. That self-sacrificing, crucified love. It's hard. It hurts. But ultimately, what it does is free us. Frees us from our own ego, from our own selfishness. It frees us to be drawn deeper into union with God. Here's what it looks like in my imagination, so bear with me. But unforgiveness is like this giant lead ball that is attached to us in our life. And it doesn't allow us to ascend to be with the Father. It doesn't allow us. It's only when that line is cut, when we're finally able to give that wrong done to us to God, to let him sort it all out, to forgive, that our hearts become free, that line is severed and we're able to rise to God. We're able to grow in deeper union with him. We're able to transform the world around us by the love that God has living through us. That is powerful. Look at the first apostles. Almost all of them, 11 of the 12, died of martyrdom, right? By the hands of their enemies, whom they loved and forgave at that moment. St. Stephen, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And it's that forgiveness that set him free, to be drawn right up into the bosom of the Father in heaven, the joy of his heart. But saint after saint after saint throughout the history of the church, it's always been about love. And it's always been about loving those who are hardest to love. That's when you know that God is really at work and powerfully at work in your heart. So bring that to him today. Don't hold on to it. It takes time. It's not going to happen with one prayer. It's a process. And so bring that person to the Lord each day in prayer. Lord, help me to forgive this person. Help me to be set free. I give them over to you. I want their best. That's what it means to love. What's the best that you can want for someone? Their salvation. That they repent and be converted. That they know God as we know him. And you will be set free to love like God in this life, which will hurt. But also, you know what comes along with it? Joy, peace, things that you can't make happen yourself. But when the Lord's love is at work in your life, joy and peace fill your heart. Today, ask the Lord for that grace. Ask the Lord for a deeper outpouring of his love into our life so that we can live this each day with those around us and especially with those who maybe we struggle with loving. Because when that begins to happen, you will experience being set free and you will experience God's peace and joy.